who we have on next is, I guess, Detroit's historian, Mr. Ken Coleman. Good morning, Ken.
Well, good morning, Brenda. Good to be back.
Well, yeah, we like go back and forth, either table talk or here or whatever.
Well, I love the 9 o'clock show too. Talk to me
I
with Brenda
know,
Perryman.
I
Yeah.
know, I know. Now you have a new book. I don't know how you crank out these books so quickly. You were just on talking about a million
Million
dollars
dollars
worth
worth of
of
nerve.
nerve,
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
Ken has a new book, Soul on Air, and this explores the radio personalities in Detroit black radio.
Absolutely. What a lot of people don't realize is radio is a medium, Brenda, that's about 90 years old, but about 75 years, African Americans have been on radio in Detroit. And what this is an effort to chronicle that history and write about some of the great voices that we had and we continue to have in the Detroit radio market.
I just love this picture on the back of Martha Jean. It's just a beautiful, beautiful picture.
Well, you certainly, Brenda, can't write a book about radio, and not just Detroit, because Martha Jean was a national figure, international figure. But Martha Jean comes here from the great radio station in Memphis, WDIA. She comes here in 1963 and earns an on-air job at WCHB out in Inkster. She worked
Henry Ruff
on
Road.
Henry Ruff Road out there where it connects with Ecorse Road. And Martha Jean Queen's career started there. But she is one of the few people that has transitioned from on-air talent to ownership. And the last 10 years of her life, really the last 20 years of her life, she was an owner of WQBH radio. And so
Yes.
she's one of the few people that have had an outstanding career as a broadcaster, but made that transition, breaking the glass ceiling, if you will, to ownership.
Was that Q for Queen?
It was. In fact, it was an acronym that stood for Welcome Queen Back Home. Because if you remember in 1982, what happened in 1980, WJLB made the switch from AM to FM. And programming like Martha Jean the Queen's programming became passe, at least for the FM market. They were looking for younger listeners, teenagers, 20 somethings. And for about 2 years, Queen was essentially sort of phased out of WJLB. She got together with investors and they created a radio station for her, WQBH, and she went on for the next 20 years as an owner and broadcaster.
When I open the book almost to the middle, I see Dr. Jim Holly, a younger Dr. Jim
Yeah.
Holly, and I see one of my best friends, Verna Green.
Well, let me tell you something. I write in the profile that I do about Verna Green. Verna Green probably doesn't have an air check. An air check is, for people that don't know the industry, it is an audition tape, really. When someone is looking to get a job in radio, they do a short air check. Verna Green does not have an air check, but there have been few people that have been more influential in radio than Verna Green. As you know, Verna came to WJLB in 1982 and stayed there for almost about 20 years. And all of those years, practically, WJLB was the dominant urban
Absolutely.
contemporary station in the market. And a lot of it, John Lord Booth says, a lot of that can be attributed to Verna Green.
Absolutely. And she's the one who brought Mason in.
Yeah, she brought Mason in. She negotiated, she had been at JLB for 2 or 3 months and she negotiated a contract to bring the electrifying Mojo,
Right.
get him from
GPR.
WGPR. And that was a great acquisition. A year later, John Mason, Rosetta Hines had come there about a month before Verna started. They built a team
Mildred Gaddis.
Mildred Gaddis. And so they built a very strong team with the anchor of Mason and Company. And for a few years, Mojo at Night, and really knocked the socks off the market, sent WDRQ home, sent WBLS. They had come here to start WLBS, sent them back to New York.
Right, I remember
Remember
that.
that? Yeah.
I remember that.
It was a flash in the pan. I write about it in Soul on the Air, but for about 5 years, WLBS 102.7 was out of Mount Clemens. It was one of those radio stations that had a very weak signal, so you almost had to be in a certain section of the metropolitan area
Well,
to hear
let's
it.
go back to weak signals.
Yeah,
When I was young, I'm a little older than you.
just a couple of years.
And ladies and gentlemen, you might want to call in if you remember some of these times, because I remember as a young girl, Ernie Durham,
Sure.
Ernie Durham, we could always hear him loud, but some stations we had to move the radio a certain way to hear. And because I remember these were in the 60s, in the earlier 60s. You know, you're getting ready to get into your teenage years.
Sure.
And we used to put a radio on the porch. We'd have it plugged in, get an extension cord. And so we'd wait for the music to come on. We'd be dancing on the
Yeah,
porch.
yeah.
And black radio was so important because, let me tell you
Sure,
this.
sure.
Before that, we'd listen to CKLW, WDRQ, or I think DRQ was around. But anyway,
CKLW was a what
well, we
station? At
heard white music, so we didn't hear that much black music.
Dr. Haley Bell and Dr. Wendell Cox petitioned the FCC for a license in 1955. They did not think they would get it. To their surprise, they did get the license, and on November the 7th, 1956, WCHB launches and goes on air. Now, to the point I think where you were going, it had a very weak signal. The FCC said two things to Dr. Bell. We're not going to give you a license in Detroit proper, where you live. We're going to give you a low wattage signal that will be very difficult to hear. But in spite of that, and the third thing they said, we'll only let you broadcast during daytime hours. I write in the book in Soul on Air, Dr. Bell and Dr. Cox almost went into the analogy is walking into a championship boxing match against WJLB with one arm tied behind your back and a blindfold around covering your eyes. They didn't have any advantage. Now, I talked about the FCC, what they wouldn't let Bell Broadcasting do. Here's the other thing. WJLB had a 20-year head start. John Lord Booth's family owned 20 newspapers in Michigan, and so they had an empire in terms of resources, in terms of a better signal. And guess what happened more years out of the average? WCHB either kept pace with WJLB or beat WJLB. A lot of it had to do with Berry Gordy's special relationship with Haley Bell. And WCHB played a lot of those early Motown hits. Even before, remember, we always talk about how it took a little while for the Temps to get a national hit. So, you know, Motown really started to kind of catch its own nationally, maybe 63, 64. But Berry Gordy had been going out to Inkster to see Dr. Cox since the late 50s. And Dr. Cox had been playing those records. WCHB benefited from that.
How do you think I heard, "Why don't you come back
Yeah,
to
yeah.
my paradise"? That was all from black radio.
It was black radio, and people like Martha Jean Steinberg, who came from WDIA, southern stations that played black music, or what they called race music back in the 50s. They understood communities, and Queen comes here from Memphis, but she gets acclimated into the city very quickly. People like Jay Butler followed her. Ed Love, playing jazz, came here in 1960 to work at WCHD, which ultimately became WJZZ, the FM station.
Okay.
But those men and women and local people like Butterball Jr., grew up in the Southwestern high school community neighborhood.
It's
Came here.
funny. It's funny because when I'm thinking back on radio, it was almost more important to have a radio than a television.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I love television, but that radio to learn about all this other music, and coupled with the fact that Berry Gordy would have these, the black
The
radio.
Motortown Review. Oh,
Yeah, play.
oh,
they
the
were-
conventions.
Well, no,
Okay.
I was going to say that the Supremes in 1961 or 2 made up "Your Heart Belongs to Me."
Okay.
These are things we would not have heard on white
That's
radio.
It's a great point. The reality is, with the exception of a couple white DJs, and I write about it in Soul on Air, your WWJs, your WXYZs at the time, the big AM stations, WJR to be sure, they didn't play black music. There were one or two DJs that did. And so it was a seismic change when Bell and Cox get an opportunity to launch WCHB. And it really set off, again, probably 15 to 20 years of dominance. That changed as FM became more popular and WJLB went FM. Really, the rivalry was in
That is
effect
right.
over then.
AM.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
listened to
AM 1440 WCHB,
Yes,
right?
yes,
You'd hear
yes.
Butterball say that, or Bill Williams, Jay Butler, Ray Henderson, Martha Jean the Queen for several years.
And in those days, we didn't have the technology, so we'd have to wait around to hear that song again. We'd have to wait around.
Well, one of the things that happened, and I know you're short on time, but one of the changes that happened in the 50s and 60s was a decided sort of change. The industry took away personality radio. You knew Martha Jean when you heard Martha Jean.
You knew Frantic Ernie
You
when
knew
you heard.
Frantic Ernie Durham. You knew that voice. I mean, speaking in a rap type cadence, well before the Sugar Hill Gang and Run
Yes.
DMC, right?
Well, the thing about Ernie Durham, like I mentioned to you, he'd play a record that was your jam, you're waiting, but he'd talk.
Yeah,
He
yeah,
would talk. He
yeah.
talked as much as he played music. And sometimes we'd say, play a
Play
song.
a song.
But his personality was very vivid.
But radio changed. You talk about Verna Green at WJLB in the 80s. Really, the industry went toward playing more music. And the slogans would be like, we play more records within an hour than the competitor. WJLB came up with a marketing concept largely due to Verna called Strongest Songs. Remember that?
Right,
Strong Songs,
right.
WJLB. So really there was a move toward talking less as a DJ or a radio personality and playing music. And
But you
really that's
still got to know the personalities, Frankie Darcell,
there's
and so
several people,
forth.
and I talked to Frankie, I profile Frankie in the book, and Frankie says radio will never be what it was in the civil rights era because those men and women that were on radio were part of the leadership. You know, Charles Diggs, people before Charles Diggs was elected to Congress, he was on radio on WJLB. His family's insurance company sponsored an hour, and so in the late 40s, Charles Diggs was on radio. Many people may not remember Bristol Bryant, but
I
Bristol,
do.
well, you do. Well, Bristol Bryant was actually an elected member of the Michigan State Senate, and that's why they call him Senator Bristol
Senator,
Bryant. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah.
because I don't know. It's coming back to me slightly. I don't know if he was on Sundays.
He was on Sundays. He
Yeah,
did a Sunday morning gospel show.
I
Yeah,
remember
yeah.
that.
You must have researched that on Google because you were
No,
not around when that.
no, but you know
But he,
me. I love history.
yeah,
I love history.
Bristol Bryant did a Sunday morning show, but he also played R&B at night too. What a lot of the radio DJs did in the early days, Rockin' Leroy White, Bristol Bryant, Frantic Ernie Durham, they would come on sometimes twice in a broadcast day. So Bristol Bryant did Sunday mornings, but he also did some evenings at WJLB. And Ernie Durham really had two shifts for a
He
lot of the
seemed to be
60s.
on all the time.
Well, let me tell you something. He's the original fly jock. Before the Chrysler Freeway was connected Detroit with Flint, Ernie Durham in the 1950s would do a shift on a Flint radio station and boogie on down here to WJLB to do a shift in the same day.
Boogie down,
Yeah, boogie
baby.
down, baby. But and that was before the Chrysler Freeway, really connected the two communities. And so Ernie, Tom Joyner certainly is the fly jock, but there was Ernie Durham was certainly a fly jock of a different era, to be sure. But the book is about 200 pages. I profile about 30 people. Most of them are on-air
Can you tell
personalities.
us some of those people before we
Sure,
go?
sure, really quickly. We talked about some of them, but the electrifying mojo, John Mason, Bill Williams, great DJ in the 1960s, Jay Butler. Remember Gene Elsey. Elsey has the distinction of working for Bell Broadcasting
He
and
had an
WJR.
interesting voice.
Great voice.
I
And
don't know how I remember him.
well, Elsie ends up becoming the first black music director at WJR. And JR was really sort of a lily white radio station up until the 70s when they hired people like Gene Elsie. But Ron Scott, the community activist,
Right.
Ron Scott did a public affairs show on, check this out, WJR. It was called Soul on Sundays. And then he took the show to WRIF, the rock station.
W. Riff?
Yeah, riff. So Arthur Penhallow and some of those rock
Yeah.
DJs. You get. Can you imagine Ron Scott in the same studio as some of
Oh
those
my
guys?
God.
But that's the vast richness of our contribution to radio, African American
Well, all I
DJs.
can say is this is how we heard music. This is how I went to a music box record shop and bought my records and
Sure.
everything, listening to black radio.
Sure.
Because it was like once you go black, you couldn't
couldn't
go
go
back.
back.
And I couldn't go back to the other ones once
Well,
I.
that's the beauty of the book. It really is a nostalgic look back and looking forward in terms
Well,
of
you
what
have a
radio's
book
doing.
signing.
I do. Thank you for allowing me to mention it. It is tomorrow, June 20th, from 1 to 5 p.m. at Eric's I've Been Framed. Eric's I've Been Framed is located at 16527 Livernois. It's right across the street from UAD High School, and it's between Puritan and 6 Mile. Okay. Michelle's telling me that I'm wrong. But the address certainly is 16527 Livernois. Eric said
Right
in
across
front.
the street from U of D. You can't miss it. And I'm sure, a bunch of us could get together and we can talk. We can
It
talk
will
this.
be there for 4 hours. We've invited some of the old Bell Broadcasting people. Dr. Bass, who is one of the in the Bass Bell Cox family. He will be there. We've invited people like John Arnold, Jay Butler will be there. It'll be a great
Wow.
time.
Well, everybody be there. It'll be square too. So, Ken, thank you
Thank you
once
so much, Brenda. I
again.
appreciate it. And that's
Oh,
your book.
oh, thank you so much. I love history, but I want to help you with that. Anyway,
We've got an idea.
ladies and gentlemen, now Mr. Dwayne Parham will be here, so we'll be right back.